Hey everyone, thanks for joining today's Automation Hour. My name is Rakesh Gupta and I'm your co-host. Here are the logistics. Online will be muted. Please post your question in the Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community, or you can post here in the GoToMeeting as well. The recording will be posted after the session. You can check out our website, automationhour.com, or our YouTube channel. Next. Uh, we are almost booked for entire year. Next time we have MVP Tom Hoffman, and you can see we have Paul, Michelle, Michael, and Nana. So if you have any use case and you want to share with community, please feel free to reach out to me or Michelle, and we will love to have you next year. So talk to our sponsor, Active Campaign and Concrete.io. Without their help, it was not possible to bring this event free of cost. Next. And here is your co-founder, David, Jen, and I started Automation Hour in 2016. And now as Jen joined Salesforce, now we have our new co-host, Michelle Hansen, and she is going to present today how to get started with Salesforce and some of the tips and tricks. So Michelle, to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so thrilled you're here. Thanks for spending your Friday with me or whenever you listen to this. A little bit about me. I work as a business architect for 7 Summits, which was recently purchased by IBM, but they're a Salesforce consulting firm. MVP, certified a few times, co-lead a Trailblazer user group. Definitely love to present, and I am totally a Flow-natic, so I am thrilled to be bringing Flow to you. All right, so this is your first date with Flow, and as everybody knows, first dates make you a little bit nervous, but you're a little bit excited. That's exactly how I think you should be feeling about Flow. By the time we're done here, you're going to realize that this has been the beginning of a very rewarding relationship, and you're going to be eager for that second date. So some things we'll just get some vital statistics, and as we go through some of these concepts, I'm actually going to jump into a trailhead playground and we're going to build some things together. If you want to follow along, since we only have an hour, we'll probably go a little fast, so you can always grab the recording and go through it at your own pace as well. But I wanted to get hands-on with it and be able to actually show you some of these concepts in action. So Flow works in both Lightning and Classic. So it doesn't matter if you've made the switch or you are still holding on to Classic, you can still use Flow. There are certain components that will say they require Lightning runtime. Again, that does not require you to be in Lightning, just requires you to go to your process automation settings and check this little box that says enable Lightning runtime, and then you can run them with that kind of interface, even from Classic. There's a lot of different types of flows. They continue to add more. So we're going to focus on some of the more common or popular ones today. So screen flows, you've got some auto-launched flows that can be called by something else like process. Another flow, for example, is a subflow, or even Apex. And then you also have some record or scheduled triggered flows. So you can set things to happen instead of going to Process Builder first and then launching a flow. You can launch the flow directly from a record change, or you can schedule it to run on a time base. So maybe you want something to run every night. You now have the ability to do that in Flow. With flows, you can do more. So not only can you create records or update records, but you can actually pull records from the database, whether or not they're related to the record that you've been working with. You can display things, and you can even delete records. So I'm a big fan of superhero movies, so you'll hear me quoting Uncle Ben quite a bit. With great power comes great responsibility. Use that delete button wisely. You can also do a lot of other cool things. You can send emails or post custom notifications to the notification bell. You can post in Chatter. You can access any quick or local actions that you've already built in your org, so you don't have to rebuild all of those from scratch. You can definitely reuse them in your flow if you have them somewhere else. And finally, some flows can actually call other flows. Now, not every flow has this capability, but they are expanding it out so that you can potentially have an auto-launched flow, call another auto-launched flow, and break those processes into different flows so you can reuse them. Or you could have a screen flow that calls an auto-launched flow, or possibly another screen flow. One thing you cannot do is have an auto launched flow, maybe something like on a record trigger, that cannot pop up a screen flow and basically stop the order of execution and pop something up and go, oh, hey, stop, hold on, I need some information from you. That does not quite work. So fun fact, if you haven't found this out for yourself, processes really under the hood are flows. They've just had a UI layered on top of them so that it's a little bit easier to use, according to some, or according to me, it's just super duper slow every time you have to refresh that UI. But if you go to a field that is used in a process and you click on that where is this used button in setup, it will actually open your process up in Flow Builder. It's kind of cool to see. If you haven't taken a look, I recommend you give it a try. So one thing I want you all to keep in mind as you're starting your journey with Flow is naming conventions. This is a big thing in code, and as we continue to get more complex with the flows and the automations we can use, it makes good sense to do this, not only for your flows themselves, which Monica Sandberg did a phenomenal best practices webinar here on Automation Hour a couple months ago, and she has a great naming convention guide that you can steal and use. For example, all of her subflows gets the ampersand symbol, the and sign, put in front so you know right away looking at a list that those are subflows. But within your flows themselves, it's also important for you to name your resources so that when you're looking through things or you're trying to read a debug log, you can sort of figure out what's going on and what's actually in play. So there's also a great ultimate guide to flow that has another link to someone else's naming convention document out there. For me, my biggest recommendation is find something that works well for you and your team. If it's not standard A or standard B, it's not what Monica does, it's not what Salesforce necessarily recommends, but it's clear, it's consistent, and it makes sense to you, then I'm going to call that a win. So some examples that I throw in here are, using underscores. Sometimes you don't necessarily have to. I use a lot of abbreviations so that I can figure out what type of resource it is. So if I have a variable for an account name, I'm actually going to prefix that with VAR. And then I use an underscore so it's easier for my brain to read. Same thing with formulas or choices. If I'm making a lot of choices and they are for different kind of question sets, I will actually put that question set modifier in there like product so that I can group them together in my resource list and find them easier. And then anytime I use a pick list choice set, and we'll go over what all of these are in a little more detail, I actually put in the object and then the field name that I'm pulling that pick list from. So I have a very easy reference to go back into setup and say, okay, what's showing on my flow screen here is a pick list choice set from this field on this object. I did see a question come in, is Flow capable to handle undelete situations yet? And to my knowledge, we do not have undelete available to us yet. What you do have is before or after saves for create or update and a before delete option. But I have not seen anything about undelete yet. Okay, so with that, let's dive in. Like I said, I wanted to get kind of hands-on and let's walk through what Flow Builder actually looks like. Okay, so I'm going to pull up my dev org here. So I'm in setup and I am just going to quickly search for flow. So once I get to my flow screen here, it's going to show me a list of any flows that are already in my org. So a Trailhead org already has a few, and we're going to go ahead and click new to get to the Flow Builder. So when we're talking about flow, flow is the automation tool. The Flow Builder is what we're in now to actually build those flows. As we go through and we have a flow built, we will have maybe multiple versions if we change it over time. And then every time this flow runs, it's referred to as an interview. So when you talk about paused interviews, you can do that with time-based workflows, things like that. Those will also be in your paused interviews, just like a paused flow would be. So we have several different types here. Screen flow, schedule triggered, like I mentioned, this is based on a time. Record trigger, so if something happens in the database, as well as platform events or auto launched where there's not a trigger directly into the flow has to be invoked by something else. So let's real quick just jump into a screen flow here. And so I'm a fan of freeform. You can also use the auto layout. It helps you kind of walk through that process to position all your elements and connect them. I'm old school OG, so we're going to go with freeform today. So you always have a start element. And so this is kind of like building a flowchart. So if you remember doing this in grade school or junior high, you had a process and you wanted someone to basically follow the steps, so you would build a flowchart. So from here, we are going to just go ahead and look at all of the elements that we have over here. So since we chose a screen flow, we can actually grab a screen, pull it on over to our canvas, and that's going to give us the ability to either collect information from our users or possibly display information to them. Actions are those quick and local actions, things like email alerts potentially. You can also call other flows as subflows, so you'll see that here as well. Then we have our logic, and our logic is how you manipulate data. So an assignment might be, if I'm going to create a new record, I'm going to create a variable to stand in for it, and we'll talk about variables in a minute, but then I need to set those fields. And by setting those fields, I'm using generally an assignment to do that. A decision is just what it sounds. I need to figure out which path I want to go down. So for example, I may have a decision, is this an account a business or a consumer? And I might go down one path or decision outcome for commercial versus residential or person. So loops we'll talk about more in a little bit, but if you have multiple records, you can do that. Brand new is a collection sort, and so that gives you the ability, if you pull back some records from the database, and so there's more than one as a collection, it gives you the ability to do some sorting on that. So these data elements, this is where it gets real. You can think of Flow as kind of a sandbox within your org. You can pull records into Flow. You can modify them to your heart's content with assignments. Nothing is actually real until you commit it back to the database, just like you can make all of the edits to a record on screen that you want, and unless you hit save, nothing actually happens. So this is the equivalent of hitting save. So you could create brand new records. You could update records that already exist. You can pull records back from the database. So maybe I want to know all of my accounts that are located in California, for example. You can also delete records. So like I said, with great power comes great responsibility. These really do get deleted. So thank goodness we have those 15 days with the recycle bin. And then you can also do a rollback records. And again, this is a brand new. So if there's any pending changes that you would want to cancel for some reason, you now have the option to do that. When we look over at our manager side, we have resources. And so there's several different resource types I want to talk about. So if you think about Flow as a desk, you could have a very messy desk and you could just throw papers everywhere and it could be entirely disorganized, and that would be no fun for anybody. So instead you put an inbox for all of the work that you need to be working on. Maybe you have a workspace in the middle of your desk for the things that you're actively working on, and then you have an outbox where you put things when they're done. So by that same token, everything that you want to use in your flow has to be in a container of sorts. So a variable is just like it sounds. It's something that can vary. So it might be that I want to take a contact's first name, and maybe that changes because it's got their nickname in there and they need to put their legal name in instead. So it's going to change. So I'm going to make that a variable. In contrast, then a constant is something that does not change. So if I wanted to put in, I often use this for the actual name of my flow. I've named my flow. I know what it's going to be. That's not going to change throughout the process. So I put that in a constant and I can call it every time instead of having to hard code it. So in case I did have to rename that flow at some point for some reason, I could change that there and it would filter through everywhere instead of me having to change the hard code everywhere it showed up. A formula is just like formula fields that you use throughout Salesforce. So if you need a formula to figure out what is 10% of 100, you can do a formula like that. And it can be text formulas, it can be dates, times, or numbers. A text template is kind of like, think about merge fields in Word. If you wanted to put together a form letter where it said, "Dear, insert first name here, thanks for your purchase on insert date of purchase here," and you wanted that to be formatted in a nice, clean way, you would use a text template for that. A choice then is something that you build from scratch to give someone basically pick list values or radio button values. So if you have a question that says, "What's your favorite color?" And you want red, green, yellow, blue, but no orange, because we're discriminating against orange here today, you could build choices for that if they don't exist anywhere else in your org and you don't have a need for a database field like this for any reason. You can also now make choices out of records and pick lists. So I mentioned before, a pick list choice set is if you have a pick list field on an object somewhere that you want to use, instead of having to rebuild it, you can just reference it. Now what you can do with a record choice set is you can say, okay, I'm going to pull back a subset of records, so maybe all of my accounts in California. And now I'm going to give these to you as a choice to pick from on screen. And maybe it's, which account in California were you looking for? Which one do you want to work for today? And you'll be able to choose that through the record choice set. Finally, stage. This is a lot like path, if you're familiar with path and lightning. So if you've got a multi-step or multi-screen process, a lot of times people will tell you that you're on screen 1 of 4, 2 of 4, something like that. With that being the case, you can put this kind of stage component on here and walk the users through the process and kind of let them know how they're progressing so they know how much they have left. Okay, so with that, I actually want to jump into a scenario super quick. And so what we're going to do for our first scenario is we are going to use a screen flow to quickly create both an account and a contact with the minimal amount of information. And Kai, I did see your question about loops. I promise we will absolutely get to loops. I will see what we can talk about with multiple loops. Another question we had come in real quick, when a flow pauses and then resumes, does it check whether the record still meets the criteria in a similar way to time-based workflows do? That I honestly do not have a lot of experience with, so I would invite anyone who has used that before to chime in with some better experience. Honestly, one of those is, that kind of whole thing is why I've generally shied away from those. Other question, can a flow be run as a specific user and not the user who called the flow? There's not necessarily the ability to call it as a specific user, but there is some ability for you to change how a flow runs between user context or system context, meaning if a specific user doesn't necessarily have access to a record or field level security to a field on a record, you can say ignore that, and in the context of running this flow, go ahead and let those changes happen. But I don't know that you can say, instead of running it as John, we're going to have it run as Paul. I don't know that that is an option. Okay, so for our scenario, let's do a quick create on account and contact. So I'm going to jump back to my elements and I'm going to start with a screen because I need to get from my user what the information is going to be for this account and contact. So kind of like building a screen or a record in Salesforce, you have all of the different field types or inputs over here on the left that you can grab. So I'm just going to do a quick search for a text box here. And I'm going to pull a text box over so that I can create one for the account name. So that's what I want the label to be. It'll auto pop an API name. Again, if you want, you can update these. So this would be user input UI account name. This helps me know that I'm expecting a user to put something in here. Also, I'm going to make this required because you cannot create an account without having a name for that record. So I'm going to grab a few more fields and drag these over. There's a couple of other field types that we could use. So for example, I would like their website, so I'm going to grab a URL field here as well. So for now, we're going to do for the account, I need an address. So we'll do street, city, state, zip. We'll do a URL, and that'll get me a pretty good start for my account. Again, basic information, making this great and quick. So we're going to do with street address. And for time's sake, I am going to skip most of the other things I'd normally do, like updating my API names. So we'll do city, state, and zip. And then URL, some people know it as that, but most of my users are probably more comfortable with this actually being called a website. So I'm just going to name this one website and update this. So there is a little bit more to this specific component. You'll notice it's got a lot more configuration options over here because it's one of those Lightning runtime components. So do I want it to be disabled? Nope, I don't. I don't necessarily have a pattern for this, but if I wanted it to follow a specific pattern, I certainly could. If I wanted to make this a read-only field to my users so they could see it, but they can't touch it, I can do that. Again, I do want to make this required, so I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to set the global constant to true. And so there are these $ variables we'll talk about in a little bit that are basically global variables that are reserved by Salesforce. Okay, so do I want to put in a starting value here? I'm actually going to put in a starting value of https:// assuming I can type, because I do want to make sure that they start it with this. So patterns are things where if you need it to follow a specific pattern, so for example, regex is a lot like this. I'm not real familiar with patterns and I don't generally use it with this a whole lot. But again, if you wanted social security numbers in or zip codes with the last 4 or phone numbers with area codes, those are all ways that you can set kind of those patterns. There's definitely more information about it in help. It's something, again, that I've shied away from a little bit. So can't necessarily answer a ton of questions about that today. Okay, so I think we've got some good things here for our account. Now we need a contact, and I'm going to go ahead and add that to the same screen because there's no reason for me to add more screens for my user. So let's come down here, and because we do this in Salesforce, we're going to need a first name field, and then we're going to need a last name field. And at the bare minimum, I'm going to need an email address. So I'm going to use this email component again because now I can require that it's actually in the right format for an email. And so I'm just going to call that email again. Again, if I want some placeholder text to show them how this should look. And once more, I want this to be required. So we're going to put this as global constant true. Okay, so I've got my fields on the page. I'm going to go ahead and click done, and it's going to yell at me because I forgot the most important thing, which is the screen overall also needs to have a label and an API name. So this is going to be account and contact entry. So now that I fixed that, I can save it. I'm going to go ahead and save my flow. We'll just call it account and contact quick create. So under advanced is actually where you can set how to run the flow. So do I want it in user or system context depending on where it launches from? Do I want it to be in system context with sharing, meaning only access to records that you as a user have, but you can update fields you may not be able to touch? Or do I want it in system context without sharing, which means pretty much you can see any data within the org. Xenia, the reason I didn't use the address component instead and use separate fields is just for speed in this demo. Definitely, I would recommend all of those great options are there and you should use them when you're building those flows. Okay, so last thing first, you'll get some warnings if you've maybe done something super bad or maybe just a warning. This one is telling me I didn't actually connect it to my start element, and that's a problem. So I'm going to go to the little dot until I get a finger, click, drag until this highlights and let go. And now I've got my arrow connecting those 2 elements, and now it will let me save it. So, all right, now I want to check my work. So we're going to debug this. So debugging is a way for you to be able to test things like if the processes, you had to activate it, go find a record, make a change to a record, and actually have it run in the wild. And so this is a way to do it without necessarily going through all of those steps. So now I can see, okay, I named the screen account and contact quick create. That shows up at the top. Here's all of my fields. I could fill them in. I'm looking at it. I'm a little confused. You know, where does account start? Where does contact start? Like, it's just not quite the way I want it. So I can close this out, go back to my flow builder, open my screen, and make a couple modifications. So I'm going to pull some display text. I'm going to put one up here at the top, and this is going to be account info. And that's what I actually want it to say. I forgot that one's the API name, so we'll put the underscore in there. So account information, and I can then make this rich text. So we're going to make it bold, underline, and I like color. So let's go for a nice green color here, and let's make it a little bigger. And while we're at it, let's center it. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. Now I'm going to do the same thing down here when I get to my contact information. I'll throw that display text again. It's just stuff I want to throw on the page for my user to be able to see. So my contact info is up here. Again, contact information. It's a rule you're not allowed to type correctly when you're on a webinar with everybody watching, because that would be too easy. So we'll make this a nice blue color perhaps. And then we'll kick that up in size as well. All right, so if I look at this now and do a quick save and a debug, this looks a lot better to me. I can see my account information, I can see where my contact breakout is. This is going to work a lot better for my users. Okay, so now that I've got the screen done, I've got all this information from my users. Now I need to actually create the records. And yes, if I needed to, I could copy and paste this component by highlighting this and making sure it's highlighted. Your copy paste is up here in the corner and it would create a new copy on the canvas for you. So first things first, I'm going to create a record and we're going to create the account first. So I'm going to label this just create account. I only need to create one record, but I could actually use multiple if I wanted. And then I'm going to use separate resources and literal values so that I'm able to grab all of the fields from that first screen to use here in creating my account. So now what did I need? I needed an account name. And we're going to set the fields that I grabbed as the billing address here. So I need a billing street. And I can click multiple of these to have these fields and just quickly fill them out. So I need a city, a state, a zip, and then I need their website. So that's what I'm going to need for my account. So now that I know what fields I want, where do those values come from? I have a list in here of everything that I have screen components. And so I can say, all right, I need my account name to be the name. I can also type ahead instead of scrolling through and find them a little bit faster. So if I know what those names are, I can do it like this. And so with the website one, again, it's a little bit of a different component. So I have to not only grab the website, but I need to know which attribute of that website I want. And in this case, the attribute I need is the value. So whatever they put in for the value of that field, that's what I am looking for on my field value here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click done. And so that's what I want to happen next. So click and drag to connect. Now that I've created my account, I can create my contact, and that has to be done separately because they are two separate objects. So we'll do create contact. Again, just one. And I'm going to use those separate resources and literal values. And so now I can search for my contact object and go through the same thing. I need a first name field. I need a last name field. And I need my email field. Now, if you've ever made the mistake of forgetting to put in an account, there's bad things that happen to contacts that don't have an account. So I'm going to make sure that I do associate this to the account that we just created. But you're probably wondering how I'm going to do that because the account doesn't necessarily exist in the database and it's not anything that I have access to from a screen. Well, I'll show you a little trick when we get there. So again, I'm going to pull in all of my fields. And again, since email is a special field, we'll go to my email and we'll grab the value. Now, what I can do here is Salesforce is smart enough to say, okay, you've created a record already, which means you probably need to know some information about it for you to use later on in your flow. So it's created a variable for me already. Then I can do account ID from create account. And this will actually use whatever ID gets assigned on that first create step to populate this in that second create step on contact. All right, so we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and then I always like to have one final screen just to confirm to the users that everything is done. So we're going to have a success screen, and it's just going to have some display text on it that tells them it was created successfully. So success, your account and contact were created successfully. All right, so nothing fancy. We're just going to throw that on the page, but we'll make it a little bit bigger. And green means good, so we'll go back and we'll grab this green again. All right, so that's the last thing that's going to happen. So when our flow runs, it's going to create, pull up the screen for us to put in the information, create the account, the contact, and then show us the success message that it was done. Okay, is there anything like styles for display text to ensure consistency? It's rich text, so really anything you can do with rich text is available. There's no way to really restrict it other than making sure the person using it follows some standards. Next question came in, if you had gone into the address component in the screen component, how would you set the values here since they're in individual fields on the account? So that's part of the reason I didn't. It's another one of those components where you would have to go in and dig through the different attributes of that component to grab the different field attributes of that component to separate out the street, the city, the state, and the zip. So how do you present the form to the user? Any number of different ways. If it's on a Lightning page, you can actually embed a screen flow as a component on a Lightning page. You can launch it from a quick action or a button. So something like this, I would probably have some sort of a widget or a button on a home page that is a quick create account and contact. Let's see here. When would you create multiple records? So with a screen flow like this, you may not necessarily, but you would use that create element also behind the scenes in an auto launched flow. So maybe if you were doing a custom clone on an opportunity and all of its opportunity products, maybe you would have multiple opportunity products that you would want to create. So that would be a reason to create multiple records. So how do you show the user what records were created? There's actually a really nifty component out there called Navigate Anywhere that you can download into your org and then use to navigate them to whatever record you want. You would have to navigate them to one or the other, not both. But you could also potentially display back to them in that display text. You could do a get on those records since you have those record IDs and display those back. Wow, these are a ton of great questions coming in. Let's see, can the address component use the country, state, global pick list? John, that one I'm not sure about. I've not used that global pick list before, so I'm not sure how those two would play together. Is there a way to avoid duplicates? Your duplicate rules will be in effect here, so it'll cause just catastrophic errors in your flow if they do try and create a duplicate. So there's ways that you can try and gracefully handle it within here. Like what you may do is have them put in a term and do a get record to see if you can find any matching accounts first before you give them the option to create. Does it matter the create order? Yes, it does. Again, if you create a contact and you don't attach it to an account, then it's an orphan contact, but no one other than the person who created it can see, not even your admins. So that's why you absolutely, in this instance, would want to create them in the appropriate order. Anytime you have parent and child records, the parents have to exist before they can have children exist. Should you create flows for objects that already have a trigger? Oh, that's such a loaded question. So I'm going to take the coward's way out and say that's something for all of you to decide for yourselves with your development staff and figure out what makes the most sense. Certainly, there are a lot of automation options that are coming and expanding. I know plenty of orgs that do. I know several other orgs who they say if there's a trigger on the object, that is the only automation we're going to allow. And so everything then has to be done via trigger. Unfortunately, that means admins can no longer do most of the things with the automation. So that's going to have to be kind of a decision up to you and your company and your specific needs. So I'm actually going to debug this, and you're going to notice that this is going to actually run and create real data in my org because I did not use that rollback records. So I'm just going to create a fun count here for Acme Inc. And they're going to be on 123 Main Street. Anytown, we'll put them in Maine today with a fun zip code. And so their website is going to be www.acme.com. And so my contact here is going to be the Roadrunner. So I'm going to go ahead and put this information in, hit next. So behind the scenes, it's running through both of our creates. Over here in this debug log, you can actually see everything that gets pulled up. So here's the screen that was displayed to me. Then all of the information that I put in it is also shown here, so you can see what I actually put in. So my first name was put in as road, last name put in as runner. You can see that the create record for the account was hit and was successful. Create contact was also successful, and that transaction was actually committed to the database. So if I jump over here to my accounts list, I have 13. If I refresh this, now I have 14 Acme's up at the top. I can pull that information in and also see that I have the Roadrunner as a contact. So one thing just to remember when you're building, always build in Sandbox. And these things are happening in the wild if you do not set them to rollback. Okay, so a couple more things to talk about. Before we get to that, question came in, if there had been any validation errors, are they shown to the user and records not saved? So again, Flow is not super graceful in handling errors. If it runs into a problem with a duplicate rule or a validation rule, it pretty much freaks out at your user, gives them a nasty unhandled fault exception error message, and then goes off to the couch and watches TV while you deal with the mess as the admin. So a lot of those things you're going to have to figure out how to handle gracefully in here. There's also another component, Eric Smith, who's another MVP, presented on this here a couple weeks ago. It's called Validation Checker that you can download and use in your flows to check for things like validation rules and duplicates and display those to the user within the context of the flow and give them an opportunity to fix it instead of just the flow kind of blowing up and having a meltdown and not knowing what to do. So all great questions. I know we're running short on time. We probably won't get through all of our scenarios, but I want to try and at least talk through a couple things. So reserved variables. There are a couple of variables that are reserved by Salesforce for very specific purposes. Number one is the concept of record ID. And so this passes the ID of the record where you were at when you launched this flow to give that flow interview context. So I created an account create flow. But if I were to do an account update flow, it would say, okay, what account are we actually updating here? And I would have to tell it that. And so by using this record ID variable, I can say, well, whatever record I'm on, I don't necessarily have to know the ID because it could change. And so syntax here is important. It follows the code standard called camel case, where the first letter is lowercase. And then the first letter of every subsequent word is capitalized. So lowercase r, capital I in ID. The other one is in record triggered flows. And this is $record because again, you have no idea what record this is going to be triggered on. You have to build it for all of them. So in this case, it's a global variable that just says whatever record triggered this flow, that's the one I mean. Just find the ID and plug it in for me, okay? And Salesforce is like, cool, I can do that. So you can also use this in scheduled flows because scheduled flows will go out and say, okay, find me all records in California and do this only on account records in California, but ignore the rest of the country. Or it may be find all cases where the close date equals today. And so because it does not know how many records or which records that's going to be, when you schedule those flows with that entry criteria that says only look for these specific records, it runs a separate interview of a flow for every single one of those records. And so you build it saying $record is whatever record that was. And so the cool thing is it already knows what object you're working on. So it still has all of those fields and everything else that's part of kind of your metadata for that object available. So you can still get to that and say $record case number or case status. if we're working on cases. And you can still say, I want you to update this in the context of this flow. Okay, so because we're a little short on time, I'm going to skip scenario 2, but essentially this would be a record triggered flow that what we would do is we would go in when an opportunity gets created and append the account number to the back of it. So that way, if someone names all of their opportunities the exact same thing, sell 1,000 widgets, you'd be able to figure out which account it was tied to just from looking at a list of opportunities instead of always having to have like a list view where account is a field on that list view. But this is a concept that definitely throws some people for a loop, pun intended. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about loops today. And so if you've ever used a filing cabinet, I think you're going to be okay with this. So what we've got here is your database is like a filing cabinet, and all of your records are files in that filing cabinet. So in the context of your flow, essentially what we're doing is we're going over to our filing cabinet and we're grabbing out the records that we want, and we're going to use a get to do that. So we're going to go get all of our California records. So now we have this stack of records here that we've pulled out of our database and we've brought it back to our flow or to our desk essentially. Now let's say every single record for an account in California needs to be updated with a GDPR, or not a GDPR, a CCPA notice for privacy. And so you're going to go in and you're going to mark all of these as needing to follow privacy rules for California. So this box needs to be checked on all records. Let's say we've got 30 of them. Well, okay, if we're talking about this in real life scenario, if you open that top file on your stack of 30 and you check this box on that paper record, does that then magically flow through to the other 29 below it? It does not. So instead, this is what we're going to do with electronic records with a loop. We are going to take the stack of records. We are going to pull that first one off of that stack and put it on the desk in front of us. And this is what we're going to do when we build a loop in Flow, and we'll go through this in a minute. So yes, Jeremy, we should be on PowerPoint for now. So you pull that first one off the stack, you open it up, you check the box that privacy applies to them. Now at this point, how many of you want to get up from your desk with that record that you just checked a box, walk back to the filing cabinet that's on the other side of the office and put it back? I know for me, this is not the way I want to spend my day, even though the exercise would be great. So instead, I'm going to then put this file on a stack on the other side of my desk that basically is my done stack. So then I'm going to grab the second one off the pile, do the same thing, check that box, toss it over here in the pile to the right. And then once I'm done with all 30 of those records, I'm going to pick up that stack of 30 records, go back to my filing cabinet, and I'm going to file them all at once. And so this is essentially what we're doing with a loop. And so now we're going to jump back into our Trailhead playground here, and we are actually going to build a flow that does something very similar. So let me jump back over here to our flow page. I'm going to close these out for now, and we're going to create a new flow. So this is going to be a record triggered flow, because what I want to happen in my scenario is anytime the account address changes, I want to update all of the addresses for the contacts that are associated to it. Now, again, this is teaching you a loop concept. This is not necessarily the best way that you should go about this or even an excellent use case for it. So please keep that in mind. We're doing this for illustration purposes. So we are going to do this on the account object. And I'm going to do this when a record is updated. So because obviously there would not be any contacts that existed when the account was created. Again, not great concept, but we're teaching you, or not great use case, but we're teaching you concepts. Okay, so you can set your entry criteria to say, okay, when something changes, this is when I want this flow to run. So in this case, I'm just going to do, and all conditions are met, and I'm going to expect that the billing street address field is going to change. So I can say billing street is changed, and then this is a yes or no, so I got my global constants for true. So then I can decide when to run this flow. I don't have an option because I'm using my is changed operator because I'm looking for a specific change. You could use this in ways where if a value has changed, it wants to know is, did that value change, or is it that that is the value, whether it was changed or not changed? So there's a lot of complication here. So then basically this is before or after the record is saved. And in this case, what I want to have happen is after that account record saves, I want to update related records. So I'm going to optimize it for this. So this will run after that record gets saved. And I'm going to go ahead and hit done. So I know we've got some questions. I want to make sure we get through this demo, and then I'll definitely go back to answer those. Okay, so the first thing that's going to happen is my account is going to change, my billing street's going to update. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go find all of my records that are related to that account that are contacts. So I'm going to say get contacts. And so I'm going to say go find all of my contacts. And so which contacts do I want? I don't want every contact in the database. That does me no good. So instead, I want all of them where my account ID, so the contact is related by the account to the record that just changed. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to find my $sign record. And so that is my account object. And so I'm going to look for the account field of ID. And it's down here in my list under I. So where the account ID of the contact equals the account record ID that just changed, that's what I want. How many do I want? I want all of them. I want to make sure I catch everybody, not just the first contact. And I just want all of the fields that are in that record. So if I need to update this later, I don't have to remember to specify all those fields. I always choose that as a best practice. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. So now that I have a collection of records, I need to loop through them. So I'm going to grab a loop on the screen, and this just tells Flow that my expectation is you're going to go through all of these one by one. So I'm going to go loop through contacts. And so the collection variable that I want to loop through, the group of records that I'm looking for, is all of the contacts that were pulled from my get that we just created. So whatever is there, that's what I want. I don't care about directions. Sometimes there's reasons that you could want them in a specific order. For today, it's not going to matter, so I just leave it first to last. Connect those two. And so now we've gone to the filing cabinet and we've come back to our desk with the stack. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do an assignment, and this is pulling that first page off of that stack to update that document. And so I'm going to say update address. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that first file, which is the current item from our loop. And so we're going to loop through that, and we're going to find that billing street address. So we're going to use the mailing street field, and we're going to set that equal to our $sign record, whatever changed, the billing street on that record here. So I can set that here equal, and I've now updated that billing street. Okay, so now you never want to put pink in a loop, because every time there's pink on the canvas is a call to your database. You are subject to governor limits because we all share the same processing power on the Salesforce platform. And so governor limits mean we want to bulkify this. So again, instead of walking back to the filing cabinet with every file individually, we want to put this into the outbox on our desk that says we're done with this. So we're going to do this with a second assignment. And so I'm going to call this one add to done. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to now take my record that I just updated, and usually when it does this, this is dot notation saying, okay, on this record, I want a specific field. Now I don't, I want the whole record. So I'm just gonna hit backspace to get rid of that dot. And so now that's actually just the full record. And we're gonna have to back up because I totally forgot I need to add this to a new collection. So first things first, I need to build my outbox. So I'm going to create a new variable resource. It's actually going to be a collection variable. So I'm going to check the box to allow multiple. And basically I always call this whatever items to update. So this is contacts to update. And so this is a record collection variable, and those records are all contacts. So I'm going to specify that here. And so now, let's try this one more time with our assignment. So we'll add this to done. I'm going to go find my current item from the loop. I'm going to take that whole record. Now, why on earth am I not able to add this? All right, so this is something I've never had happen before. Let me double check my variables and make sure I have these right. Yep. All right, so my contacts to update is set. It is a collection variable of contacts. I did it backwards. That's what it is. All right. Apparently it's Friday afternoon, y'all. Okay, so my variable is my record collection, so my outbox. And what I want to do is I want to add that current item that I was working on. I did it backwards. Come on, Michelle. So I've got my outbox. Now I'm going to add to it that record that we just got done updating. So now I have my second assignment. So I'm going to move that over here. So I can now connect this back to my loop, go grab the next record. And so I'm going to continue through this loop until all of the contacts on that account have been updated. So actually, I'm going to move this up here and we're going to go the other, we'll go counterclockwise. Okay, so now after I've done that, we're going to do a create. Nope, we're going to do an update. I need to grab the right one here because now I want to update my contacts. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to use the IDs and all of the field values that are in a record or a record collection. So as I added all of those records that I was done with, they are in my contacts to update collection. And so I do this because I know, what do I want to update? I want to update everything that's in the update collection. So now that I have that set, I'm going to do this after the end of my loop. So basically, now that we've gone through our whole stack, we're ready to take that whole stack back to the filing cabinet here. So let's go ahead and do a quick save. And then I'm going to activate this one so we can actually see this work out in the wild. All right, so jumping back over here, I'm going to find a different account that's got some multiple contacts. So Salesforce is always a great one to use. So if we look, we've got two contacts. We've got Jake and Siddhartha. So if I open up Jake here, just for an example, we can go ahead and look at the information that we have. Okay, so right now we don't have any information in here for a mailing address for Jake. So what I'm going to do is on my Salesforce account, I am going to come in here and give them a new billing address. So this is actually their shipping address. So I'm going to move this over here just so we have some data. And I'm going to update this because they actually have a PO box. And so I'm going to update their billing street here. So I went ahead and did this. So while this is saving, you see it's taking just a minute. All right, looks like we have some new sandbox limitations in our playground that is not letting me do this. Well, that makes for a not fun demo. This is why you shouldn't spin up Trailhead Orgs the day before, guys. But anyway, normally what would have happened is that would have updated behind the scenes with that flow, but apparently something is going on with my playground today that's not going to let me do that. So, all right, well, I know we're about 5 minutes left, so I will jump back and answer some more questions. I also want to make sure that we talk through some of the other options I've got for resources here. So I actually put in the presentation that we will make available descriptions for all of the toolbar elements that we talked about briefly, as well as the resources. And then there's a number of other resources to definitely help you learn more about Flow. So with that, let me jump back over into the questions that we've got coming in. Okay. If we have an existing trigger doing the same thing, how can we handle logic to exclude from the flow logic? Krishna, I think definitely if you have an existing trigger, then you would not want to have a flow that was doing the same thing for sure. That's one of those things where you need to make some decisions in terms of your automation design on, are you going to continue to keep it into a trigger, or are you going to move that out of your trigger and into flow instead? Let's see here. Is the concept of interview the same as the threat of execution or transaction? Ted, I think I'm just getting into code, but I think they are probably considered synonymous um, by way of what I understand about a transaction. So essentially, if the transaction is whatever your code is supposed to be doing, then yes, a flow interview would be basically whatever your flow is supposed to be doing. There is a question, will the recording be sent to the attendees? Yes, we will have the recording available generally an hour or two after the session is done, and you will get a copy or a link to it with the thank you email for attending. We also post these on YouTube, so if you want to access it later or lose that particular email, you can always get to it on our Automation Hour YouTube channel. Okay, let's see. Yeah, thank you for all the help that came through while I was trying to figure out why I can't add things to a collection. There are still days that I do dumb things that I just probably should have paid closer attention to. So, let's see. Is it good practice to have only one flow per object, or multiple flows can cause conflicts? Okay, so disclaimer here, this is Michelle's opinion. This is not Salesforce's opinion. Salesforce is putting out a lot of guidance about this. I'm a fan of kind of a hybrid approach. Salesforce's guidance with this last release was to control your flows running by using entry criteria. So you may have 6 flows on account, but all of them will be triggered by different things. One may be triggered by a account type changing. The other one might be on an address changing. The third might be because the status of an account went from prospect to customer. So basically what would happen is it would evaluate behind the scenes which flow should run and only run it when it's strictly necessary. This is a pretty big change from what they have always told us about processes and even triggers. With processes, it was always one per object, and then you basically use all of those decision nodes in there to decide whether or not the action should run. That's certainly a pattern that I had planned to use with my flows. And what I was basically going to do is, when we talk about trigger context in code, basically a trigger runs, and it was one per object, and then it was before you create a record, after you create a record, before you update, after you update, before you delete it, after you delete it, and before or after you undelete it. So there's 7 trigger contexts with trigger, and there's 5 of those available to flow. So basically what my plan was is I would have one flow for every trigger context. So I'd have a flow that ran before I created an object, and everything that I would need to do before I created that object would be in there, and I would just decide which actions to take with a series of decisions. Now that there is different guidance from Salesforce, I'm going to have to go back and relook at that. But definitely, I would recommend keeping your eyes and ears on that, because it does get complicated, and I have run into situations where when I've tried to do that, flow A runs, updates something, and that update causes flow B to run. Flow B runs and updates something that then causes flow C to run. And if you get into kind of what I call that cascade effect, you can run into limits and potentially have some unintended consequences. And my brain has not quite figured out how to get through all of that and make sure it all works very well together. So lots of great lots of great info. How often does this happen? Michael, if you're referring to automation hour, we do it just about every other week. Around the holidays, we'll take a couple weeks off, and we actually, I think, have a couple back-to-back ones due to some scheduling conflicts. So you can always check out automationhour.com for more. If you're talking about how often do demos go wrong when you're doing them live, more often than I would like to admit, and I should have known better, but hey, I'm human, so we'll roll with it. Next question from Ted. How does Apex code and flows communicate between themselves, exchanging values between themselves? So there is an action to be able to invoke Apex. And in that action that you can drag onto the canvas, it will basically ask you for the information that you need to pass over to whatever action that is. Again, I'm really new to Apex, so I have not used that. But I know there's a lot of great Apex actions that essentially are built to extend flow. So what they basically do is ask you for flow variables or resources to be able to pass whatever the Apex needs and handle it there. Someone asked, do you remember where that latest guidance from Salesforce is found? So there's a couple places. Diana Jaffe is the PM for Flow. She was on the Salesforce Live for Winter 22, both for the admins and for Flow specifically. And that guidance came out, it was all over Twitter. So there's that. There's also several blogs, and there's one called The Ultimate Admin Guide to Process Automation that you can definitely check out. I don't have the link off the top of my head. Also, there is the Architect Guide site that has the Architect's Guide to Record Triggered Automation that is supposed to help you decide what the best automation pattern is. So I would definitely look for that as well. And I will see if I can't get those into the slide deck with the resources screen before we share that out with all the attendees. So with that, we're over the hour, and thank you all for being here. I hope I got to all of your questions. If for some odd reason we didn't, please do feel free to reach out. I love talking about Flow. Definitely don't know everything, but love to help people new to it be a little less intimidated. So with that, we'll say thank you. Have a great weekend, and we'll see y'all later.
Thank you for presenting and sharing your knowledge.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.